Sorensen.
Hello. My name is Sorensen, and the spelling of the first name is Soren, S-O-R-E-N, and the last name is Sorensen, S-O-R-E-N-S-E-N. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of any group today, but I have been involved in propagating native plants and trying to establish on my own family's private property populations of plants that I can harvest seeds of and supply to the DNR and to contractors to restore habitat. So one of the first things that I would question about whether or not it's reasonable are the penalties and the costs for mitigation, because it's not clear that when we lose whole species of organisms, when we lose significant chunks of habitat, that it's ever possible to mitigate or do remediation for that loss. So, some of the statements of the previous speaker I'd like to reinforce, and one of those is the need to rely on citizen scientists. And I would ask whether or not it's completely reasonable that the DNR is now restricting its assessment of the abundance or vulnerability, endangeredness of the various species, restricted to the taxon that are listed, taxon groups that are listed in the how do you abbreviate this? The sonar, right? That there are taxon here that just by the freak availability of experts on DNR staff, where there were taxonomists who were experts in these specific groups, that some of these groups became listed and are now being considered and surveyed only because of the presence of those experts, and maybe not because of a rigorous search of scientific literature about the rarity of other groups of organisms. So I would encourage the DNR to reach out to citizen scientists, to expert groups outside of the DNR, reach out to a larger base of people than just those experts that they know and work with, or I've worked with in the past on these at the University of Minnesota and other research institutions based here. And specifically with invertebrates, I would encourage them to reach out to groups like the Xerxes Society. One of the groups that I think it's unreasonable that it does not show up in this list is the order Hymenoptera, right? With the
Please spell that.
Okay, Hymenoptera is Hymenoptera, and Hymenoptera are ants, wasps, and bees. Like beetles, like flies, this is one of the most diverse groups, diverse orders of insect taxa out there. So it's not reasonable that there would be no Hymenoptera in the state of Minnesota that are endangered, threatened, or species of special concern when there are so many less diverse groups that are present on that list. Present on that list only because of experts who were on staff before. Also with the large number of vascular plants, flowering plants, that are on that list that are endangered, it's not reasonable that there aren't pollinators. A large number of plants have very tight relationships with Endangered bees or other bees that are not like honeybees, right? That would also be in decline if the plants that they have obligate relationships with are in decline. So I would encourage the DNR to survey for these lesser known groups of native bees that aren't related to honeybees, that are probably threatened due to habitat loss and due to the loss of these plants that they have evolved in close association with. That we shouldn't just be disturbed by the loss of a species as defined by a type specimen of a plant that's glued to a specimen sheet at the University of Minnesota, but of an interaction between a community of insects that pollinate it, of other critters that might disperse the seeds, of the microbes that associate with the roots of that plant. So we're obviously missing a lot of related species when you look at that large list of vascular plants that are disappearing from our landscape. And that's a real loss that we can't ever mitigate or remediate by finding somebody for purposefully destroying, a rare population of plants. So I would specifically encourage the DNR to also look at a group of native bees that are related to the honeybees that have become threatened in part because of the diseases of commercially kept bees, both bumblebees and honeybees. The diseases of commercially kept bumblebees are linked to the decline of bumblebees in other states. And the Xerces Society, I'll just provide Rich with a copy of the Xerces Society report on 3 bumblebee species that they are concerned about across the United States. 2 species in the eastern U.S.
Thank you. We'll mark that as exhibit 13.
Now, back to more local issues that might be more passionate, less biologically based, less wonky than my urging the DNR to look at bumblebees. This is the edge of civilization facing northwards towards this like vast wilderness area. And there are real enemies of wilderness in industry that want access for resource extraction or want to open up wilderness for recreation with motorized vehicles. But there are a greater number of people who appreciate wilderness and are dependent on ecosystem services of these vast undeveloped areas of our northern forests and bogs and forested swamps. And I believe it's important that we have species of special concern that remain on the list, like the wolf, that are really flagship species that are indicators and symbols of the value of these vast tracts. We will not ever be able to take one of those bumblebee species and argue that it should be protected in the same way that it's easier to protect the wolf. And it's clear that the other species status sheets for other large vertebrates that are also in decline in northern Minnesota, and I would contend that the wolf is in decline at this point because we've just lost a fifth or a fourth of its population this last calendar year due to a factor that when you look at the lynx species sheet, specifically the DNR has called human-caused mortality of Minnesota's small lynx population as the primary threat to the species. Obviously, a major threat to the stability and the presence of the wolf on our landscape is human-caused mortality, whether that's licensed killing of the wolf or unlicensed killing of the wolf, or damage to population, or damage to the landscape that intact population here in Minnesota is dependent on. And Minnesota is rare in having, in the lower 48, an intact large population of wolves. As I understand, and they've been delisted federally, except for places where they're no longer extant, like Iowa and Missouri. But what we had when the wolf was federally listed was rare, in that we had an intact integral population of wolves that wasn't an experimental reintroduction. Like the presence of the wolf in the western states where hunting first occurred in recent times is in areas where the wolf population was experimental. It was a reintroduction. It therefore had less protection under the Endangered Species Act. And I think that it's particularly destructive that the wolf hunt was introduced here through political pressure without consulting the tribes, the DNR agencies that are kind of the peer agencies of the Minnesota DNR on that state-to-state basis based on treaty. I think that that was harmful and destructive, and it's not something that was forecast. If you look at the species status sheet for the wolf, there are very few recent documents that are presented as part of the these references, right? The selected references. The most recent reference is 5 years old. Elsewhere, there's that annual update of statistics, the last of which that's quoted in there is for the year 1999 in the list of selected references. So there's very little current data that the DNR is referring to here. There's very little peer-reviewed published scientific evidence of their estimate of what the wolf population is in the state of Minnesota. But things that they do refer to include the Minnesota Wolf Management Plan. And obviously, the DNR was forced, due to political pressure, to chuck that out the window and make an emergency decision to allow the taking of the wolf for sport purposes in the state of Minnesota, breaking the agreements that were made, whether they were statutory or whether they were just common sense agreements. But what has come about in the last year is by no means reasonable or fair, and it's possibly illegal. So in the case of the wolf, it's not reasonable that the wolf is being delisted at this time. And it's very important that the DNR begin to find ways to justify the protection of these vast habitats in northern Minnesota, like our pattern peatlands, which are globally rare. You know, peatlands bind a huge amount of carbon. We talk about climate change being a threat to these other species, and I notice that there's no mention of climate change being a threat to the wolf. I think it's clear there's a political agenda where the DNR must claim success with the wolf to justify its past actions. But if we consider climate change to be a hazard even to the moose or to the lynx or to other species, it's not reasonable that there isn't some mechanism in place, whether it's the use of some flagship species to represent our bogs, that the DNR would ever allow deep mining of peat in places like the Pine Island State Forest, which can never be replaced, never be mitigated, releasing tons and tons and tons of carbon in the air, you know? More than a square mile of peat dug 15, 16 feet deep. It's probably worse than coal mining. Elsewhere they do talk about the threat to those habitats due to biofuels, a growing reliance on biofuels. So I think that's specifically listed with the links in looks like the fourth paragraph there. The last sentence is in the basis for proposed Minnesota status. The last sentence is their current interest in biofuels harvest may exacerbate this threat. So we do need to find ways to preserve our northern forests and wetlands and bogs. And we might need to include groups of invertebrates that we're not considering, whether they're sponges that we discover that are out there that are obligate or endemic and found only in these sorts of wetland habitats that we only have in our pattern peatlands. But the DNR doesn't have the resources right now, right? Another justification for relying only on these groups or only listing these taxa is because of the presence of experts on DNR staff or this limited list of people they've relied upon in the past. So I definitely encourage the DNR to draw on a larger pool of citizen scientists, the other expert groups that are concerned with the rarity or endangeredness of other groups, like the various IUCN groups that list the worldwide databases of the species that are considered to be endangered, but draw on a larger pool of data and experts so that we can have a more realistic sense, a more reasonable sense of what's truly endangered on our landscape before we lose more. Thank you.
Thank you very much.